The hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin, a soft, rhythmic sound that made the weary passengers almost forget the long journey ahead. Elisa Harper, a military officer, sat quietly among them on the flight from Atlanta to Washington, D.C., with her jeans, light jacket, and an inconspicuous crossbody bag, sporting the U.S. Army logo. She blended in perfectly with the crowd, but only she knew the weight of the mission ahead. A presentation at a major defense conference where she would present a strategic project she had worked on for years. This moment meant everything to her, especially as a black woman in an environment that often overlooked her talents. As the flight began, Elisa felt a few curious glances directed her way, a familiar occurrence. People often didn't understand who she truly was, an experienced soldier, dedicated and skilled, hiding behind a casual appearance. She sat down, placing her bag carefully in the overhead compartment, and opened her laptop to review the important documents for her presentation. But the peaceful moment was interrupted. A middle-aged white woman sitting across the aisle stared at her, her gaze piercing. Elisa ignored it at first, focusing on her laptop, but soon enough, the woman whispered something to a flight attendant. The attendant hesitated before walking away, only to return minutes later with an airport security officer in tow. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his tone colder than necessary. "We have received information that you may not be on the valid passenger list. Please leave the aircraft so we can verify." Elisa frowned. This didn't make sense. "Excuse me, what did you say?" "I have a ticket, and I went through security." "Is there a problem?" Before the officer could respond, the woman across the aisle spoke loudly, her voice laced with suspicion. "She looks like the criminal." Elisa's heart sank. She knew exactly what this was. It wasn't about her ticket or her seat. It was about how she was perceived because of her appearance, her skin color, the way she looked, the way she carried herself. It all seemed to be a threat in the eyes of this woman. The officer, perhaps unconsciously influenced by the woman's words, looked Elisa over, scrutinizing her as if waiting for something to go wrong. "Please step off the plane, ma'am," he insisted. The tension was thick in the air, but Elisa, despite the urge to fight back, kept her composure. She stood up, her mind racing with the knowledge that this wasn't just a random incident. It was a reflection of deeper prejudices that were all too common. As she moved towards the exit, the murmurs of the passengers filled the cabin. Some looked away, others watched with curiosity, but Elisa knew they weren't all seeing her for who she truly was. She was more than her appearance. She was more than the stereotypes imposed on her. But Elisa wasn't just an ordinary woman. She wasn't just anyone who would let an unjust accusation slide. She had served her country for over 15 years, and she knew what it meant to stand firm in the face of adversity. What the passengers didn't know, what the woman across the aisle didn't know, was that Elisa Harper was someone who had overcome every obstacle in her path, someone who had fought for her place in a world that constantly tried to diminish her. As the officer led her off the plane, she turned her head slightly and said in a calm but firm voice, "You will regret this." The story of Elisa Harper didn't end there, though. As the flight attendants and security officers stood by, the woman who had started all of this realized that she had misjudged someone based solely on their appearance. The more the incident was discussed, the clearer it became that this had been an act of racial prejudice. Elisa was not the criminal. She was the hero of her own story. The story went viral, not just because of the injustice Elisa faced, but because it spoke volumes about the prejudice that still runs deep in society. It wasn't just about a woman on a plane. It was about the racial biases that affect everyday life, the assumptions made because of the color of someone's skin. Alice's story spread like wildfire, becoming a symbol of resilience and the need for change. In the end, the world got to see the truth, not just about her, but about the fight against racism and injustice that continues to this day. The flight had begun as a simple trip, but it ended up changing everything. Elisa Harper stood tall as the security officer's words echoed in her ears. "I saw her on TV last week. I'm sure it's her." The accusation hit her like a cold wave. and she could feel the blood rush to her face. Her mind raced, trying to process what was happening. "Criminal?" Elisa asked, her voice a mixture of surprise and anger. She was shocked, confused, and deeply hurt, but she kept her composure, her years of military discipline guiding her. "I don't understand why you would say that. Please leave the plane," the security officer repeated, his tone now even more stern. His posture was rigid, his authority as unyielding as his prejudice. Elisa took a deep breath and tried to explain herself. "I am a US military officer. I have a valid ticket, and I'm on my way to an important meeting. If there's any problem, you need to verify it before asking me to leave the plane." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officer's eyes narrowed, and his attitude shifted from skepticism to blatant hostility. His smirk was full of judgment. "I don't care who you are. You are currently disrupting this flight. If you don't comply, we will be forced to take drastic measures." Elisa's chest tightened with frustration, but she knew she had to remain calm. Every eye on the plane was on her now. Some passengers ducked their heads, pretending not to see, but most watched with a mix of curiosity and judgment, the tension in the air thickening. "You have no right to remove me from the plane without good reason," she replied firmly, her voice unwavering. "I demand that you verify the information before acting like this." But the security officer didn't budge. One of the guards sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Don't make things difficult for everyone. It's hard to believe someone like you is on this flight. Who do you think you are?" Elisa's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms in an attempt to hold back the rising tide of anger. She glanced around, hoping that someone would speak up for her, but the room was silent. A few passengers nodded in agreement with the guard's words, their expressions hard and judgmental. A flight attendant, perhaps seeing the growing tension, tried to intervene. "Please, don't disturb the passengers. Maybe we need to check more carefully before—" The security officer cut her off, his voice sharp with authority. "Don't interfere! We know what we're doing!" The situation was escalating. Elisa could feel the pressure mounting, but she stood her ground. She knew this wasn't just about the flight. It was about the prejudice she faced daily, the stereotypes that followed her wherever she went. And no matter how uncomfortable it made the people around her, she was not going to let them push her into silence. One of the security guards stepped closer, his hand hovering dangerously near his gun belt. "Are you getting off the plane now?" he asked, his tone demanding. Elisa's pulse quickened, but she refused to let fear control her. She had dealt with worse in her career. This moment, no matter how tense, would not break her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice clear and strong. "If you want me to leave, you need a good reason, and you need to verify everything." But instead of verifying the situation, one of the security guards shouted, his face red with anger, "Get her off the plane now!" Elisa's eyes locked with his. She wasn't going to let this intimidation go unchallenged. The stares from the other passengers, the whispers that followed her every movement, couldn't take away her strength. She knew who she was, and she knew her rights. The flight attendants, the passengers, the security guards, everyone in that cabin was about to witness something they hadn't expected. Elisa was no ordinary woman. She had been forged by years of dedication, service, and hard-earned respect. The people around her, though unaware of her true power, would soon find out that they had underestimated her. The tension in the small airplane cabin reached its peak. "I don't need to verify anything. You need to cooperate now," one of the security guards demanded, his voice sharp, full of authority. But it was his next action that pushed Elisa Harper to the edge. With one swift movement, he pulled out his gun, pointing it toward her, the cold steel glinting under the harsh overhead lights. Elisa's heart raced, but her eyes remained steady, unwavering. She was no stranger to tension, to threats, to unfairness. The military had taught her how to stay calm under pressure, how to never show fear, even when confronted with the worst. She slowly stood up, her posture strong, her chest filled with pride and determination. "Fine," she said, her voice even, but forceful, each word cutting through the charged atmosphere. "I will go, but I will make sure you're held accountable for this." As she was escorted off the plane, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Some passengers whispered among themselves, some turned their backs, but no one dared speak up in her defense. The weight of their silence pressed against her as she was led down the narrow aisle. But Elisa knew that this was not the end of her fight. It was just the beginning. In the airport security room, Elisa sat upright in a cold plastic chair. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were sharp as knives, every muscle in her body radiating determination. She was not just another victim of prejudice. She was someone who would not stay silent in the face of injustice. Two security guards stood by the door, their conversations few and their attention fixed elsewhere. They completely ignored Elisa, as if she were invisible, as if her presence didn't matter. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than ever, each passing second an echo of the growing anger inside her. She had been forced off the plane with no valid reason. Just the baseless accusation of a passenger who had seen her and assumed the worst because of the color of her skin. After what felt like an eternity, one of the guards finally spoke, breaking the silence. "We're keeping you here until we have information," he said coolly, not even bothering to look at her. Elisa's voice was firm as she replied, "You haven't even asked for my identity or checked my identification. What gives you the right to detain me?" The guard shrugged, clearly uninterested in continuing the conversation. "We're just following procedure. If you don't want any more trouble, I suggest you cooperate." Elisa stifled a laugh, her anger boiling just beneath the surface. "Cooperation?" she repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "You insulted me from the start. This is not cooperation. This is abuse of power. Not only are you doing it wrong, you are violating my civil rights." Before the guard could respond, the door opened and an older security guard entered the room. His eyes scanned Elisa up and down, full of judgment, filled with an obvious, underlying prejudice. His sneer was barely concealed as he chuckled. "Who do you think you are talking so loudly here?" he mocked. "You look more like the type to cause trouble than an innocent person." The words stung, but Elisa refused to let them break her. She knew that this wasn't about her, but about the way she was being perceived. She was a black woman, a military officer, someone who had worked hard to get where she was, and yet she was being treated like a criminal for no other reason than her appearance. Elisa's resolve grew stronger. The more they belittled her, the more they treated her like a threat, the more determined she became to make them face the consequences of their actions. They might have tried to humiliate her, to diminish her in front of others, but they had no idea what they had just started. This was not just a battle for Elisa Harper. It was a battle for every person who had ever been unjustly accused, misunderstood, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. It was a fight for justice, for equality, for respect. She wasn't going anywhere, not until they recognized who she was, not until they were held accountable for their racism. Elisa narrowed her eyes, her patience worn thin. "I think you guys are making law enforcement look bad," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of injustice. "I demand to speak to someone in higher authority." The older security guard sneered, his contempt palpable. "You are in no position to make any requests. Just sit back and wait." But Elisa stood her ground, crossing her arms calmly, yet her resolve was unshakable. In her heart, she knew that this was not just a battle for her own dignity, but for all, those who had been treated unfairly, whose voices had been silenced simply because of their race, their gender, or their background. The tension in the small room grew thick, every moment pressing closer to a breaking point. Then, the door opened. A middle-aged man in a police uniform stepped in, his presence commanding immediate attention. On his chest was a name tag. Captain Richard Donovan, the airport police chief. His stern voice filled the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the scene with authority. One of the security guards quickly stepped forward, eager to explain the situation in their favor, blaming Elisa for the alleged non-compliance. The sheriff listened carefully, but his eyes narrowed as he processed the situation. Donovan nodded, then turned to Elisa. His voice softened, but there was still an edge to it. "Ma'am, I'm Richard Donovan, the police chief here. I've been informed that you were refusing to cooperate and causing a disturbance on board the flight. We need to verify your identity. Do you have anything to say?" Elisa looked him in the eye, her expression cold, unflinching. "Before you asked me to leave the plane, did anyone check my papers? Did anyone listen to my explanation? Or are you just relying on a woman's baseless accusation because I have a different skin color than hers?" Her bluntness hit Donovan like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he was silent, taken aback by the sharpness of her words. He glanced at the security guards, clearly dissatisfied with the way they had handled the situation. He understood the gravity of the moment, the humiliation, the prejudice, and the failure to follow proper procedure. "I need to see your identification," Donovan said, his voice softer now, tinged with a hint of understanding. Elisa reached into her wallet and handed him her military ID. As he read her name and the title Captain Elisa Harper, United States Army, Donovan's expression shifted dramatically. His eyes widened with realization, and a flush of embarrassment spread across his face. "Miss Harper, I'm sorry," he said, his voice laced with regret. "I didn't know you were a military officer." Elisa stood up, her back straight, her eyes never leaving his. "Who I am is not important," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "What matters is how you handled this. You didn't check the facts. You didn't verify anything. You just acted on your prejudices. That's unacceptable." The weight of her words hung in the air as the police chief turned to the security officers, his voice stern and full of authority. "You have seriously violated procedure," he said, his anger directed at them. "You should have verified from the beginning instead of humiliating an innocent passenger." The security guard, who had been the most vocal in harassing Elisa, bowed, his head in shame. He said nothing, knowing that there was nothing left to say. His actions had been called out, and he could no longer deny the truth that Elisa had so boldly pointed out. The room was silent, the tension now replaced by the uncomfortable realization that prejudice had caused a woman who had served her country with honor to be treated unjustly. Elisa, though still standing strong, felt a small but significant shift in the power dynamics. This was not over, but it was a start. The police chief, now fully aware of the mistake that had been made, looked at Elisa with newfound respect. "We will make sure this is addressed properly," he said, his voice carrying a tone of genuine remorse. "You have my apologies, and I'll personally ensure that this matter is fully investigated." Elisa nodded, though the fight was not yet won. She knew this was just a step in the process, but it was a step toward justice, toward accountability, and it was a step that she, for one, was proud to take. Sheriff Donovan, determined to make things right, called an emergency meeting in the security room. "We need to review the surveillance footage from the plane and the airport," he instructed, his voice full of authority. "We need to clarify everything." Meanwhile, Elisa was asked to leave the security room, but she refused. "I want to know how this is handled," she said, her voice resolute. "I'm not going anywhere until I get a public apology from you." As the footage played, it became increasingly clear that Elisa had done nothing wrong. Her calm demeanor and valid explanations were evident, while the accusations from the white woman on the plane were completely unfounded. The truth unraveled in front of everyone's eyes, and Elisa's innocence became undeniable. Sheriff Donovan's face grew darker as he watched the footage. He realized the security officer's behavior had not only been unprofessional, but also deeply rooted in racism. The wrongful treatment of Elisa was a stark example of racial prejudice, and he knew something had to change. He turned to Elisa with an apologetic look, his voice sincere. "Miss Harper, I sincerely apologize for the injustice you endured today," Donovan said, his tone filled with regret. I will ensure that those involved will be dealt with appropriately. Elisa stood firm, unshaken by his apology. I don't want just an apology, she replied, her voice calm but full of conviction. I want your system changed so no one else has to go through this. With that, Elisa walked out of the security room, her posture proud despite the humiliation she had just endured. She had made her point clear, and though the experience had been painful, her pride and determination had not wavered. As Elisa walked through the airport, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with curiosity, and some with caution. But Elisa paid no attention. She knew that her actions had set something in motion, a change that she was determined to pursue until the very end. Her gaze fell upon the woman who had caused all of this, the white woman who had falsely accused her. The woman was standing, talking to a flight attendant, desperately trying to explain the danger she had thought she had uncovered. But when she saw Elisa, she froze, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. I was just doing what I thought was right, the woman stammered, trying to justify herself. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. Elisa's eyes remained steady, unwavering, but there was no anger in them, only a quiet strength. You made a serious accusation without any evidence, she said, her voice measured but firm. Do you think that's right? The woman lowered her head, unable to meet Elisa's gaze. I just thought I was protecting everyone, she muttered, her voice small and apologetic. Elisa didn't let her off the hook. You're not defending anyone, she replied, her words cutting through the air. You're just using your prejudice to hurt others. Remember, what you did today didn't just affect me. It hurt the entire community of color and the voiceless. The woman had no response, only mumbling an apology that barely reached Elisa's ears. But Elisa didn't reply. She simply walked away, leaving the woman to face her own shame, her own realization of what her actions had caused. Later that day, Sheriff Richard Donovan kept his promise. He called an emergency meeting of the entire airport security team. As they gathered, Donovan's voice rang out, firm and decisive. We were wrong, he began, his words filled with authority. Wrong in the way we handled the situation. Wrong in the failure to verify the information. And wrong in allowing personal prejudices to cloud our judgment. The security officers, visibly uncomfortable, stood in silence, knowing they could not refute the truth. Donovan continued, his tone resolute. From now on, we will follow the proper procedures. We will not allow biases to affect how we treat others. We will do better. And with that, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't just a reprimand, it was the beginning of change. For Elisa, this was a small victory, but one that she knew would ripple out and inspire others to stand up against injustice. As she left the airport, Elisa didn't feel like she had just been a victim of racial prejudice. She had been part of something bigger, a catalyst for change. The journey wasn't over, but the fight for fairness, for accountability, and for justice had taken a vital step forward. Sheriff Donovan's resolve did not waver after the events at the airport. He took immediate action to address the prejudice displayed by the security team. The 3 officers directly involved in the incident were swiftly suspended, and as part of their disciplinary action, they were required to attend anti-racism training and courses on how to handle similar situations more professionally. But that was only the beginning. Donovan announced that the entire security team would undergo a comprehensive 3-month retraining program. The focus would be on creating a fair, professional, and non-biased work environment. He made it clear that the behavior displayed that day was not acceptable and would not be tolerated again. Elisa, meanwhile, was approached by airport management with an invitation to attend a public press conference. At first, she was hesitant. She had no desire to turn her experience into a media spectacle. But after much consideration, she realized that sharing her story in the public eye was the most powerful way to bring attention to the kind of injustice she had faced and to protect others who might suffer the same fate. The day of the press conference arrived. Sheriff Donovan stood before the cameras, acknowledging the fault of his team and the wrong that had been done to Elisa. "We extend our deepest apologies to Captain Elisa Harper for what she has been through," he said, his voice somber. "This has been a hard lesson for all of us, and I pledge to do everything in my power to ensure that no one else is subjected to this kind of injustice at our airport." Elisa then stepped up to the podium after him. Though this was not something she had planned, her words were strong, clear, and sincere. "I am not here to seek pity or attention," she began, her voice steady and confident. "I am here to say that we need change, not just in airport security, but in society as a whole. Prejudice doesn't just hurt individuals. It undermines the very values we claim to stand for: equality and justice." For a moment, the room was silent, as if everyone was absorbing the weight of her words. Then the silence broke, and a round of applause filled the room. It was a powerful acknowledgement of Elisa's bravery and the truth she spoke. A few weeks after the incident, Elisa's actions began to echo through the community. Her determination to stand up against injustice sparked conversations in airports, workplaces, and homes. Though the journey wasn't over, Elisa had made sure that the message of accountability and change would continue to be heard. A few weeks after the press conference, Elisa received an unexpected letter. It was from a young black girl, just 16 years old, who had been deeply moved by Elisa's story. The girl wrote about how Elisa's courage and determination had inspired her to pursue her dream of becoming a military officer, despite the prejudice she faced in her own life. As Elisa read the letter, a soft smile spread across her face. It was a reminder that even in the face of injustice, small actions by one individual could create ripples of change. The impact of her stand for what was right had extended far beyond what she could have imagined. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her bag, knowing that this letter was not just a token of gratitude, but a symbol of the hope she had ignited in someone else. It reminded her that her fight for justice was not in vain. As she walked out of her house, preparing for her next business trip, Elisa knew that her journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges, but she felt ready to face them head-on. She was no longer just an officer. She was a symbol of resilience and hope, believing firmly that justice and truth always prevail for those who continue to fight for them. With the weight of the world on her shoulders, yet fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, Elisa walked on with pride. Her fight had inspired change, but the battle for equality and fairness was an ongoing one. Thank you for taking the time to follow Elisa's story. If you love this content, don't forget to click like, share this story with friends and family, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories. Once again, thank you for being with us, and see you in the next stories.